In about 3 hours, the trial for the former police officer accused of killing George Floyd is expected to begin. Derek Chauvin is facing charges in connection to Floyd's death. Bystanders captured video of the since fired officer kneeling on Floyd's neck. The 46-year-old father can be heard saying he can't breathe. Jesse Weber is here now with a preview of today's trial. He's an attorney and host on the Law and Crime Network. Thank you so much for joining us, Jesse. So for people unfamiliar with how things will be unfolding, good morning, what typically happens on the first day of trial like this one? And, you know, what's sort of the timeline for sort of key moments as we look forward to the coming weeks?
Well, while this trial has many similarities to other trials, this really is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of trial. There's so much at stake here. But what we are going to see are the opening statements. So that is the opening presentation by the prosecution and the defense. How does the prosecution believe that Derek Chauvin should be found guilty of murder and manslaughter? They're going to lay out a preview of their evidence. And the defense, for the very first time, we are going to get a clear argument of what their game plan is, how they're going to try to show reasonable doubt. Right after that, we'll hear some beginning witnesses. Now, I believe that if the prosecution is going to lay out their case, the first witnesses we are going to hear from, you mentioned it in your intro, are the people who were around George Floyd at the time of his arrest, the people who videotaped that, the people who could be heard in that video. It sets the stage for what happened. Now, this trial is going to last maybe 4 weeks, could last a little bit longer. Nothing's ever set in stone. We've already seen a lot of hiccups already in jury selection. Now, again, that is a long time. But then at the end of this jury that has been selected will be sequestered in a hotel room to start their deliberations. We are a long ways from that. But today is really the start of an incredible trial that all eyes will be on.
So in your opinion, what are the strongest arguments and evidence for both the prosecution and defense?
Well, the prosecution, they need to establish that Derek Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd or contributed to the cause of George Floyd. Now, I think that is a very strong point to make, because what are we supposed to believe? What are we supposed to believe? That given the alleged drugs that were in George Floyd's system, his underlying health conditions, he was going to die at that moment if police never got involved? I think that's a little bit difficult for a jury to believe, especially since the defense has been so keen to bring in this other arrest of George Floyd back in 2019. I've said it before, the more you say that he was, the incident was so similar in 2019 to 2020, well, he lived in 2019, he didn't live in 2020. Now, the defense does have a lot of ground to go with, because all they have to show is reasonable doubt. They just need to convince one juror that maybe Derek Chauvin didn't do this. And listen, even if they can't show the defense that Derek Chauvin caused the death, if they can't battle that out, if they can't say, look, he did cause the death, what they need to do, the defense, is say, well, that doesn't rise to the level of murder or manslaughter. He didn't know this was going to happen. He never intended to harm George Floyd. He did what his training told him to do. That's their best ground. I'm not saying it's going to work, but that's where they need to go.
You know, talking about the jurors, obviously the attorneys worked really hard to pick individuals they felt could be impartial, or at least those individuals felt they could be impartial. But now they got to maintain that impartiality as they listen to the arguments and deliberate. You mentioned sequestration. You know, how does the court sort of ensure that jurors remain impartial, or do they have to sort of police each other?
Look, I'm very nervous about this. We only have 2 alternates. Now, the reason we only have 2 alternates is because there were space limitations in the courtroom due to COVID. I get it. But in this kind of trial, with this amount of pressure, with what's going to be happening outside the courtroom, with any kind of influence, and on top of the fact that you're dealing with COVID, I'm very nervous that we will run out of jurors between now and the end of the trial, and we might have a mistrial. Now, I'm hoping that's not the case. But look, these jurors, I listened to each one of them. The prosecution and the defense did a superb job of weeding out the jurors that showed this kind of bias and partiality. And I think at the end of the day, these jurors are ready. Some of them are even excited to be a part of this case. That's a whole separate issue if you want a juror so excited to be on a case. But I really do believe that this is the right jury. It's a great representation of the community. You have a different set of age, different set of gender, coming from different walks of life. I'm confident in who's been selected. I just would have liked to see a few more jurors.
And then, so finally, give us some context. I think you used the word monumental, or maybe I thought it. I'm not sure, but this is a big deal. How big a deal is it? What are the implications beyond this court case when it comes to the future of policing, racial justice, or perhaps all of that has already occurred? We've already seen in the wake of George Floyd's death a national conversation about policing and public safety, a conversation about whether or not, and we've actually seen some police departments ban certain moves, reduce their budget and reallocate some of that money to other services. So maybe the fallout has already occurred. But what's your take on just the impact that this case could have moving forward?
And I agree with you. There's some people who say you'll really never see monumental change. I disagree with that, because the very fact that Chauvin and his former colleagues have been arrested, that they have been charged, and now they are going on trial, I think that's enough of a message. Now, having said that, what people want to happen in that courtroom may be very different than what the law can support. Now, I do think no matter if he gets acquitted, there are people who are going to be very, very upset, and maybe rightfully so, I understand. But again, what happens in that legal courtroom is very different than what happens in the public. I think if he gets convicted, it does send an even stronger message that you have to take a second notice of what you're doing in these kinds of situations. I think one of the things that really upset people the most at the video, other than the fact that George Floyd died, was this kind of brazen attitude shown by the officers that they know best. Do not get involved. We know what we're doing, until someone dies. And then you find yourself in saying, well, I was just following him, or I was doing this. No, I think that conversation has already began, but this trial and the result of this trial will dictate how police departments train their officers and what police officers think about before they go into the field. I think that is an important message to be sent, no matter the verdict here. But at the same point, we have to understand what are the limits of police power. And we've seen it kind of here in New York, with this kind of immunity that is being taken away from officers. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? We are at the beginning of a change. We're just not exactly sure where this change is going to go.
Yeah, really smart observation. Jesse Weber, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we will have the opening arguments for the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin later on this morning. It is set to begin at 10:30 Eastern, and once it gets underway, we're going to bring it to you live.